This episode is sponsored by Wren, a website that helps fund projects to combat the climate crisis. Click the link in the description to learn more about how you can make a monthly contribution to support projects like rainforest protection programs. We can see the effects of the climate crisis in many different ways here on land. But climate change also affects our oceanic buddies underwater. It's all interconnected in one complex global system. So here are some episodes we've done over the years about how climate change affects the ocean. Sometimes we can even see the effects of climate change on underwater animals that wash up on land. And here's the story of one of those animals. This beach isn't normally red. You are looking at tens of thousands of pelagic red crabs that washed up on the shores of Monterey Bay. They're also known as tuna crabs because tunas love to snack on them. But these crimson creatures aren't really crabs. They are a kind of squat lobster, crab relatives that look like flattened lobsters with their long tails that curl up under their bodies. And they're kind of like little red weathermen because their presence on the beaches of California indicates something unusual going on below the waves. Normally, red crabs are mostly found in the waters off Baja California, a Mexican state that borders the US state of California. There, they dine on phytoplankton, those tiny microscopic marine algae suspended in the water that we've talked about many times before, as well as any other edible bits they can find. Once they're adults, they start to hang out near the bottom in the benthic zone. But the larvae, juveniles, and young adult crabs live in the epipelagic zone, or the upper part of the open ocean, hence their name. Of course, pelagic red crabs don't always stay in one spot, and their movements have been pretty reliably linked to ocean and climate patterns. Sometimes these movements are helpful to the crabs, like they'll move with their food during certain stages of their lives. Take a 2004 study in the journal Deep Sea Research Part 2, for example. Scientists recorded water temperatures and salinities at different depths and locations along the Baja California coastline. That let them map out ocean currents in areas of upwelling, where cooler, food-filled water gets pulled upward to the warm ocean surface. Scientists also used sonar and fishing nets to measure how many red crabs there were, and they found that there were more crabs in areas of strong upwelling. Turns out the pelagic red crabs were moving with the upwelling, which makes sense since the plankton they eat flourish in that nutrient-rich water. It's also no coincidence that the lobster's breeding season is right around the time of the year that upwelling normally occurs, since being able to get more food means healthier breeding adults. But the crabs don't get much of a say in where they end up. The thing about spending quite a bit of your time floating around in the top layer of ocean is that you can easily get carried away. Literally carried away. The crabs can swim, sort of. They propel themselves backward by flapping their tails and tucking their legs into their bodies. But they aren't great swimmers, especially when they're young, so they can get swept up in strong ocean currents, which carry them northwards to California, even as far north as Oregon. And when this happens, hordes of them may wash up on shore. You'll sometimes find red crabs covering entire beaches. These mass strandings have been linked to large-scale climate events like El Niño, where the permanent trade winds that flow around the equator weaken, which causes warm currents to flow from South America northward along the California coast. For example, a study published in 2015 in Fisheries Science examined the number of red crabs in their usual habitats off the coast of Baja California 6 times between October 2004 and March 2007. And they found that there were more crabs in the area during cold water La Niña events and fewer during warm water El Niños, because the warm waters were carrying the crabs away from Mexico and north toward California. The upside of all this is that washed up red crabs may be a nice source of food for seagulls and other hungry predators during El Niño events, when their usual fare tends to be more scarce. But the crabs don't just signal El Niños, they're also warning marine biologists and beachgoers alike of our changing climate. For example, a study published in 2019 in Scientific Reports linked the distribution of red crabs with another kind of ocean pattern, marine heat waves. In the winters of 2014 and 2016, areas of the Northeast Pacific Ocean warmed to 2 to 4 degrees Celsius above normal for months on end, creating what some people call the warm water blob. The blob wreaked havoc on ocean life, killing marine mammals and triggering harmful algal blooms. But it also meant that more than 35 species of marine mammals, fish, fish, seabirds, and algae temporarily moved or got carried northward. That included pelagic red crabs, who made it as far north as Newport, Oregon. These northern shifts might not seem like a big deal now, but scientists think marine heat waves and other ocean warming events are already more frequent than they used to be, and are gonna be happening more often due to climate change. That means coastal animal and plant communities will likely look really different in the future. And the red crabs show that changes are already happening, as strandings are becoming more and more common. The first recorded one was in 1859, then 1959, 1969, and 1983. Then there were a total of 8 recorded strandings between 2015 and 2017 alone. In a way, these little red crustaceans are acting as bellwethers for the ocean. The impressive sight of millions of beached squat lobsters is a clear signal that our ocean is being altered, one that's far more visceral than, say, satellite images or temperature readings. And by studying these little red drifters, scientists can gain a better sense of how ocean habitats are changing and what the effects of those changes will be. So climate change is pushing around sea life and stealing their lunch money. And those crustaceans aren't the only little guys getting carried by the changing currents. Here's how snails end up migrating the entirely wrong way. Life in the ocean is a little different than it is up here. For one thing, water holds on to heat a lot better than air, so temperatures tend to stay the same from day to day rather than fluctuating with the sun. But this does not mean that ocean-dwelling organisms are less susceptible to rising temperatures brought about by the climate crisis. In fact, most marine critters are adapted to live at a very narrow temperature range, so even a tiny change can quickly spell trouble. And we might not have understood just how much trouble without the help of an unassuming little snail. The three-line mud snail is a small, spiral-shelled snail commonly found crawling around beneath the waves on the North Atlantic seafloor. While the adults spend their lives on the bottom of the ocean, their larvae start out life swimming around up in the water. These babies are so small that they are at the mercy of the waves and ocean currents. This snail species typically spawns in the summer when the water temperatures warm up enough to signal to their bodies that it's baby-making time. And the summertime ocean currents in the North Atlantic gently tow the freshly hatched larvae out to cooler, deeper waters found at the edge of the continental shelf, where the babies can then feed and grow and eventually settle onto the seafloor as adult snails. However, in a 2020 study, researchers from Rutgers University uncovered a disturbing trend happening with the three-line mud snail, along with potentially dozens of other bottom-dwelling species living in the North Atlantic. They found that this little snail was missing from the deeper, colder waters of the North Atlantic outer shelf. They expected to see increasing populations of these creatures in the deeper waters because the deep waters are places of refuge. They're cooler than the shallow waters, whose temperatures have risen dramatically in recent years. Instead, the researchers found higher populations of these snails in the warmer waters close to shore, which is not good because, remember, most marine creatures are adapted to survive at narrow temperature ranges, and the baby mud snails are particularly fragile. They're less likely to make it to adulthood in warm waters than colder waters. The researchers believe that this shift in habitat is an unexpected consequence of climate change. But this is not something the snail is choosing to do. See, in response to changing temperatures, some organisms choose to travel north or south toward the poles to seek refuge in cooler waters. But these snails are too small to travel that far. Instead, the snail's physiology makes them easily influenced by changes in the ocean's physics, and it's making them migrate in the completely wrong direction. First, their spawning behavior is temperature dependent, so when the ocean waters warm earlier in the year, they trigger an earlier spawning event. This means those little baby snails are floating around in the water in the springtime instead of in the summer, and the currents in the North Atlantic vary throughout the year, changing directions depending on the prevailing winds, as well as the amount of water running into the ocean from rivers on land. Which leads to the second issue. The baby snails are being pushed around by springtime ocean currents, which are different from summertime currents. The spring currents funnel these babies towards the shore instead of away from it as they do in the summer, and the waters closer to shore are shallower and warmer than the deeper edge of the shelf waters. That means fewer babies will survive to adulthood, and the survivors will spend the rest of their lives at those higher temperatures, which means that those adults will spawn even earlier in the year than past generations, trapping the three-line mud snail in a feedback loop that they cannot escape from. This unfortunate circumstance could spell the beginning of the end for the three-line mud snail and potentially for several other bottom-dwelling North Atlantic species. species. That's because other seafloor dwellers, like sea stars, clams, and worms, have similar spawning and larval behavior to the three-line mud snail. In fact, researchers have found that since the 1960s, around 80% of bottom-dwelling species have disappeared from the deep waters of the North Atlantic, potentially all unwilling victims of this wrong-way migration phenomenon. And this may not just be a North Atlantic occurrence, this could be happening in other locations around the world. Through no fault or choice of their own, bottom-dwelling species are being pushed to the limits of their survival thanks to the climate crisis. But at least this is helping us to understand the many unexpected ways the climate crisis can affect the creatures who share the planet with us, and maybe help us understand how to help them. Little baby snails aren't much of a match for something as big as climate change. They need our help. We humans can do something about fighting climate change. Today's sponsor, Wren, aims to help people take action. They are a website with a monthly subscription that helps to fund projects to combat the climate crisis. Wren searches around the globe for promising projects like planting trees to sequester carbon and improve the quality of the soil. And if you sign up to offset your carbon footprint, you'll get updates telling you where your money went, like what trees you planted. And as a bonus, we have partnered with Wren to protect an extra 10 acres of rainforest for the first 100 people who sign up using our link in the description. And luckily, it's not just us and the snails in the fight against climate change. We've also got a much larger friend on our side because some of the biggest ocean animals are having a positive effect on the climate. Whales. Commercial whaling was really bad for whales, especially sperm whales. People killed so many of them in the 19th and 20th centuries that even 10 years after hunting was stopped, there were less than a third as many sperm whales as there were before. And their populations are still recovering today. But not only did whaling land sperm whales on the endangered species list, it may have caused some major problems for us too, by making climate change worse. And that's because all those whales were helping cool the planet by doing a lot of what every animal does best: pooping. While the blue whale is the largest whale in the ocean, sperm whales aren't exactly tiny. They grow to be up to 18 meters long and weigh around 35,000 kilograms. And no surprise here, they'd need to eat a lot to reach such massive proportions. Each whale consumes around 200 tons of food a year. Yes, I said each whale. Luckily, they are excellent divers, so they can feast on the buffet of creatures like squid and octopus that live thousands of meters down. These yummy critters are full of nutrients, including iron, something not always easy to come by in the ocean. They have tons of it because it gets bound up in the dark pigment in their ink. And I promise, that's not just a fun fact, it will become important in a moment. Now, while sperm whales eat most of their food in the dark depths, they do all of their other business at the surface. That's because when they're diving, their bodies shut down all non-essential functions to conserve oxygen, and that includes expelling waste. Also, it just so happens that their poop is super loose and runny, which is a lovely visual. Point is, because of its consistency, it floats around at the top of the water instead of sinking. And these floating watery feces are packed full of iron because the whales don't need all the stuff they get from those deep sea noms. About 90% of it gets pooped out. But you know what does need iron? Plants. It's an essential nutrient for photosynthesis. So all the tiny photosynthesizers that live in the ocean, collectively known as phytoplankton, love iron, and they don't care if it's from runny whale poop. In fact, in some spots in the ocean, these tiny plants literally can't get enough of this stuff. The dissolved iron in the water is so low that it keeps their populations from growing. That's because they require a specific form of iron called iron 2 that can easily dissolve in water. And most iron 2 makes its way into the ocean via dust. So places far from dusty lands, like the Southern Ocean that surrounds Antarctica, are extremely low in dissolved iron. But whales can help with that. Whales that live in low iron waters are like giant ocean crop dusters, fertilizing the water with their iron-rich poop. When a bunch of iron becomes available, the phytoplankton reproduce like it's going out of style. They can double their numbers in a single day, creating swirls of green visible from space. We call this a bloom. These blooms do a bunch of photosynthesizing, so they build tons of sugar out of carbon dioxide and water. That means they suck up lots of dissolved carbon dioxide that went into the water from the air. These blooms end up feeding all sorts of ocean creatures, from microscopic animals to filter-feeding whales. Eventually, though, all that yummy iron gets used up, and any phytoplankton that aren't eaten die. At this point, the carbon in their bodies could get broken down by microbes and returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. But most of it sinks too quickly for that, so it ends up at the bottom of the ocean instead. And once it's down there, it stays down there. That carbon gets trapped for a really long time, like thousands of years or more. So the ultimate effect of whales pooping is less CO2 in our atmosphere. But it couldn't be that much, right? Well, in 2010, researchers actually crunched the numbers to figure out just how much carbon the 12,000 sperm whales living in the Southern Ocean were helping store. They found that while these whales breathe out around 160,000 tons of carbon per year, their poop fertilizes 400,000 tons of carbon storage. That's a net storage of 240,000 tons a year. Now, this is a drop in the bucket compared to the billions of tons of carbon dioxide humans pump into the air every year. So the Southern Ocean sperm whales aren't making much of a dent in our climate problem all by themselves. But they aren't the only whales in the Southern Ocean, and researchers believe that other species found there may be doing the same thing. Also, there used to be over 1 million sperm whales worldwide before commercial whaling. Just imagine the carbon storage potential if their populations rebounded to that level. And we're working on that. Sperm whales are currently protected in the US under the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and also listed under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And conservation groups continue to push for legislation to protect the animals, as well as encourage companies to adopt whale-safe fishing gear and shipping practices and reduce ocean noise pollution. So the whales are already doing their part to combat climate change. Now, thanks to science, we know that by helping them bounce back, we can do ours. And that's not the only reason this kind of research is important. It also helps us understand how ocean ecosystems function as a whole and how quickly that delicate balance can be disrupted. And that is just some plain old important science right there. I never thought I'd say that I wish we had more whale poop, but there it is. I said it. I believe it. It's how I feel. Yes, even the runny stuff. We'll take whatever we can get. Unfortunately, just wishing for whales to fix all our problems isn't gonna cut it. So, what can we do about climate change's oceanic impacts? How about seaweed farming? Carbon dioxide did not create the climate crisis on its own. Humans have been releasing it and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere way faster than Earth's natural cycles can pull them out again. And a lot of those natural cycles depend on plants to remove carbon from the air. But even though plants are some of our best carbon-removing tools, the way we've been growing them for food produces a pretty significant carbon footprint. So some researchers have turned to the oceans. Introducing seaweed as a staple in our agricultural industry could help reverse some of the effects of climate change. And while no one solution is likely to save the world, these little ocean organisms have big potential. The thought of agriculture might lead you to picture some beautiful farms with rows of green, carbon dioxide-consuming crops. But agriculture is a significant contributor to the climate disaster. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency estimates that in 2019, 10% of U.S. emissions originated in agriculture. Making fertilizer and managing soil quality requires energy, and livestock cattle burp up methane, which is a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. Not to mention, farm equipment needs fuel. Now, I like eating, and I bet that you do too, so eliminating agriculture isn't really on the table. But there are some creative ideas out there for how to improve its climate impact. One of them is growing in the oceans as we speak. Seaweed-based food systems have the potential to leave a much smaller carbon footprint than the land-based food systems we rely on today. Now, seaweed can refer to a huge array of different organisms, including plants and algae, but they're all ocean-based photosynthesizers that use carbon dioxide to produce energy. In general, seaweed and seagrasses can take in more carbon compared to land plants, and they can store 2 times as much carbon per square mile as a tropical forest. And there's extra advantages to these marine organisms growing in the oceans. CO2 dissolves in seawater, leading to the formation of carbonic acid, which decreases the ocean's pH. This ocean acidification is a huge threat to marine life, particularly corals and shelled animals. But seaweed uses that CO2 for photosynthesis and can pull it from the water, not just the air. Several studies have shown that growing seaweed can raise the pH of the surrounding water during the day when photosynthesis is taking place. By preserving organisms that would otherwise be more susceptible to acidification, seaweed helps maintain ocean biodiversity. All this adds up to seaweed being a pretty sustainable crop. So the question becomes, what are we gonna do with all of it? Sushi rolls are great, but some researchers envision seaweed taking a central role in our diets, maybe one day becoming a staple crop alongside wheat or maize. To that end, seaweed farms are the fastest growing area of food production in the world. But it doesn't have to be food for us, because a lot of our crops go into feeding our livestock. In a 2015 study, researchers fed cows a seaweed-based supplement which reduced the methane in their burps by 99%. So we could cut emissions from cattle production just by feeding them a little seaweed. But seaweed's agriculture uses go beyond just growing and eating the seaweed. We could also use it as a better substitute for synthetic fertilizers. Seaweed can be heat-treated to make carbon-rich additives for soil. This seaweed biochar, short for biological charcoal, is rich in nutrients and can increase crop productivity. The process of making biochar releases some gases that can be collected and used to make fuel, and others that can be burned to produce the heat needed to make more biochar. That means components of seaweed could be used to make biofuel, at least on a small scale, but also help sustain itself as a source of fertilizer. Now, seaweed is not going to replace all of our fuel supplies. A 2017 analysis reported that we may only be able to grow enough seaweed to produce 10% as much energy as what we currently get from wind farms. That's because we can't just build as many seaweed farms as we want wherever we want. They need specific temperatures and nutrients that aren't found all over the ocean. Even if we could, the seaweed probably wouldn't grow as well in colder waters, so it wouldn't take in CO2 as efficiently. This means it's more reasonable to limit seaweed farms to specific locations where they're going to thrive. So no, seaweed cannot save the world, not by itself. But the odds of finding a single solution to all of our climate change problems are not good. Seaweed is one of the many very promising tools that we can use together to make a dent in cleaning up our mess. And seaweed farms are just one solution. While there's a long way to go, there's lots we can do to protect our planet, including ocean life, big and small. Thank you for watching this episode of SciShow. And if you want to see more about Ren, again, there's a link in the description.